Hobbes and the Modern Natural Law, Lecture 2. In the last lecture, I talked about Hobbes's account of happiness as basically the pursuit of subjective pleasure and the avoidance of subjective pain. I talked about Hobbes's account of the state of nature, the human state of nature, as a war of all against all, because the passions of mistrust and fear and greed and pride will cause human beings to be in conflict with one another anytime they're in a situation where there's no overarching authority to keep people in line. So our state of nature is a miserable condition of a war of all against all. And this also comes from the fact that we are by nature equal, according to Hobbes, in the sense that we're all equally vulnerable. None of us is invulnerable, and therefore we must all be concerned about our own preservation. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to move on to talk about his account of natural right and natural law, which is his kind of basic ethical teaching about right and wrong and the way that rational people can get themselves out of the war that is the state of nature. So this gets us to chapter 14, which is called the laws of nature. Now, even though our natural conditions are so bad, according to Hobbes, fortunately, we're equipped by nature with what we need to get ourselves out of such a miserably anarchic condition. There are actually certain passions in us which impel us to wish us to leave. So even though we have some passions, very powerful passions, greed, pride, fear, that can put us at war with one another, we have other passions that can lead us to peace. The first one of which is another form of fear, which is fear of violent death. The same thing that can cause us to sort of take action to try to preserve ourselves can also move us to think about maybe there's a better way to do things. So for Hobbes, it's, we really don't want to die violently. And that fear of violent death can be used as a foundation for a political order if it's acknowledged. Another thing he notes is the desire to live comfortably. So it's not just fear of violent death, but the desire to be happy, to live comfortably. That desire is something that an enduring political order could be built on if it's appealed to right. And also, as he says, there's a third passion, hope, the hope to attain a comfortable life through our own efforts. So if you can find a way to appeal to those passions, then you have a basis for a better political order. When we appeal, you don't want to die. You're afraid of dying. I get it. You want to be happy. You want to be comfortable. You're willing to work in order to gain comfort for yourselves. Those for Hobbes are very rational passions. Reasonable people can use those passions to guide them towards peace. And of course, beyond these passions, we have reason. We have the capacity to think, and that capacity to think can help us to devise rules that, if we followed them, would allow us to live comfortably with one another instead of being at war. So these precepts discovered by reason to further our comfortable self-preservation, those are the laws of nature. That's what he means by the laws of nature. But he begins by distinguishing natural right from natural law. And so on page 21, he talks about the right of nature, by which he means the legitimate liberty or freedom a person has to do as he sees fit for the preservation of his life. So his argument is, by nature, we all have the right to use our own judgment to do what we think necessary to preserve ourselves. We have a right to do that as individuals. But alongside the right of nature, he has the notion of the law of nature. And a law of nature, according to him, is a rational precept that commands us to do those things which further our preservation and forbid us from doing those things that are contrary to our preservation. Okay, so again, the right of nature is the freedom that everybody has to use their own judgment to do whatever they think is necessary to preserve themselves. A law of nature is a rational precept that furthers our preservation by commanding us to do what will preserve us and forbidding us from doing those things which are destructive to us. Now, Hobbes makes a shocking claim on page 22 that in the state of nature, everybody has a natural right to everything, even to other people's bodies, to make them slaves. So every human being has a natural right to everything. Why? Well, because we have the right to anything we need to secure ourselves. But the state of nature, which is a state of war, is so dangerous and insecure that there is no rational limit to the amount of power we need to secure ourselves. Right? We have a right to anything that we think could further our preservation, but pretty much anything that we could acquire will further our preservation. So we have a right to everything. If I think I will be more able to secure myself by enslaving you than by letting you be free, then according to Hobbes, I have a right to enslave you. And you would have a right to enslave me. If I thought killing you would make me more secure, I have a natural right to kill you. If I thought taking your stuff would preserve me better, then I have the right to take your stuff and anybody else's stuff and everybody's stuff. Basically, everybody has a natural right to make themselves the ruler of everything. Right? But the funny thing is the fact that everyone has the same right. Since everybody has a right to everything, it means that this right of nature doesn't give you any security. Right? Invoking the right of nature is not going to give you any security. The state of nature is permanently insecure because everybody is impelled and empowered and allowed to do anything they think necessary at any time to anybody else. So it's pure anarchy. Right. And usually what will end up happening is you'll have a relatively small number of strong people dominating everybody else. That's what he thinks. Hence, this is one of the reasons why, as he says on page 22, the first law of nature is to seek peace. In Hobbes's words, every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining. So obviously, if you're concerned with preserving yourself, then the very first thing the reason is going to tell you is we've got to get out of this mutually destructive war. Find a way to establish peace. That's the first thing reason tells you. If you use reason to figure out what can I do to preserve myself, seek peace. But as he notes, when peace is elusive, when you can't have peace, right, then you still have this right to do whatever is necessary in order to survive. So there's that right of nature. But since peace is incompatible with asserting your natural right to everything that you want or think you need, so he says the second law of nature is that each person should be willing to give up their natural right to everything and instead live under a set of rules that are common to everybody. Right? So the first law of nature says seek peace whenever you can. The second law of nature says give up your right to everything when that is compatible with peace. So in order to have peace, people have to renounce their right to everything. And this, of course, leads to a question, which is under what circumstances can you actually be secure by giving up that right? Right? Because for Hobbes, in any situation where peaceful coexistence can't be assured, you retain the right to do whatever you want to preserve yourself. So the laying down of that natural right and the pursuit of peace has to be done under certain conditions, namely conditions where you are genuinely secure, where that doesn't lead you just being a sitting duck, right? Because if you're in the midst of a bunch of warlike and violent people and you decide, well, I'm just going to act peaceful, that's not going to preserve you. That's going to destroy you. You're going to be taken advantage of and you're destroyed. If you're around murderous, warlike people, you have the right to fight back. It's only when you're in a situation where you truly believe that you can be secure, namely under a government, that it is rational to give up your right to everything. Now, he deduces a bunch of other natural laws from these too, but these are enough for our purposes. So, in short, reason tells you to get out of the state of nature in whatever way you can, so long as you retain the ability to preserve yourself. Now, he notes in the last paragraph of chapter 15 that these natural laws aren't strictly speaking laws, right? They're not actually promulgated by some government or something like that. For a law to be a law, there has to be not only a command, but there has to be some power there to enforce the law. And that doesn't apply in the state of nature. So the laws of nature are not really laws in the strict sense. They're more like rational precepts, Just things like, what are some rules that if we all lived by would enable us to preserve ourselves better? And any rule that you can come up with that enables mutual self-preservation, Hobbes would say, well, that's a law of nature. It's something discovered by reason that's useful to preservation. Now, notice too then that you don't have these kind of hierarchy of ends like what you have in Aristotle, where the goods of the soul, the virtues, are the higher things. For Hobbes, the law of nature is much more basic than that. It's basically just preserve yourself, seek peace, give up the right to everything when doing so will help you to preserve yourself. So it's a lower natural law. There's no hierarchy of natural goods here. And then this leads in chapter 15 also to Hobbes giving a different account of the nature of morality. Right? So Hobbes summarizes the precepts of the natural law in one precept on page 23. Do not do unto others what you don't want them to do to you. Right? That's sort of like the negative correlate to the golden rule. So it's not do unto others what you would have them do unto you. It's don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you. The basic claim is if everybody followed that rule, there would be peace and everybody would be able to preserve themselves. So according to Hobbes, nature doesn't ask us to love one another. It just asks us to preserve ourselves. It doesn't ask us to perfect ourselves. It asks us only to preserve ourselves. And reason tells us that in order to preserve ourselves, we must refrain from harming others. Now, in this same context, Hobbes actually mocks Aristotle's account of virtue as a mean. Remember, Aristotle says that the virtues are sort of perfections of the various parts of our nature, and that this perfection is usually a mean between a defect and an excess. So courage is the perfection of kind of fear and anger, where we are neither too afraid nor recklessly bold. Moderation is the mean between seeking too much pleasure and being too indifferent to pleasure. Proper pride is the mean between being too humble and being too vain, and so forth. So virtue lies in the mean. But Hobbes has already implied that nature doesn't ask us to perfect ourselves. There might not even be such a thing as natural perfection, according to Hobbes. And so for Hobbes, he deduces the various virtues not from an account of our nature, but from an account of the moral law or the natural law. Now that's on page 24 of your packet in chapter 15, where he basically says, the moral virtues are nothing other than qualities of character that we need in order to live peacefully with one another. Right? It's like moderation. The reason why moderation is commended as a virtue is because it's part of what makes a person peaceful and sociable, a good neighbor, a good member of society. It's not actually perfecting our nature. It's just adjusting us to society. Saying, courage is useful to society. So virtue is not an end. It's not the goal of life. It's not a perfection of anything. Virtues are just means to comfortable self-preservation. And comfortable self-preservation is what nature asks of us. So it's a very different kind of ethics from Aristotle that's related to very different understandings of happiness. So at this point, we've seen some important aspects of Hobbes' thought, right? That happiness is not perfection, that we are all by nature equal, that we all have a certain natural rights, and that in thinking about politics, we have to begin with thinking about what human life would be like in a state of nature without government. So in the next lecture, I'll talk about Hobbes' philosophy of government proper, which covers the readings on pages 24 through 29 in your packet, where he lays out the need for the consent of the governed, and this is sort of a controversial aspect of Hobbes, where he lays out his argument that governmental power must be absolute. There's really no such thing as limited government. That for government to do what it must to preserve its citizens, governmental power must be absolute. So that's what we'll get to in the next lecture.